My name is Jilde Garst. I am a researcher at the Erasmus School of Economics. I also am the coordinator, one of the coordinators for the new Master Economic Sustainability. So that master will start from September. Unfortunately, you already had your master done, but if you want to do another one, you're very welcome to join. But today it's not the main focus on me. I'm just moderating this conversation, and we'll have a conversation with two well-esteemed experts on green policy. And let me first introduce Professor Alexander Rinnooy. He has, of course, currently he's presiding at the University of Amsterdam for a bit, but has a big history here.
Traitor.
Yeah, traitor. He has a big history here because in the 1980s he was not just a professor in operation research, but also the rector magnificus at this university. But when we're talking about green policy, we can mostly focus on his work in the Socio-Economic Council. This is the council, one of the main advisory councils for the national Dutch government when it comes to economic issues. And is a representative of both the unions and the employees organization.
Right.
Yeah. So he has a big experience there. He's also been a member of the Senate. So for the D66, so the Democratic Party, and currently back at the academia. So and I heard he's doing very great teaching on negotiation. So if you're interested in that, please do talk to them later. But today we focus on green policy. Our second speaker, who will be arriving shortly, I hope, is Kees Vendrik. Kees Vendrik also has a lot of experience in policy making. He's currently the chief economist at the Triodos, one of the most sustainable banks in the Netherlands, but mostly known for his work for the Green Party here in the Netherlands, GroenLinks. He's an expert in finance and economic policy. Has worked for the sorry, I'm a bit distracted now. He's been a representative in the House of Representatives. He's been a member of the Algemene Rekenkamer, which is also a very important council. And we also know him as he's been heavily involved in the Dutch climate agreement. So that was raised last 2018-19, I think. He was the chair of the electricity table. So that table actually, what they do is try to get all these stakeholders together and try to create a shared responsibility for the transition of the electricity market. So if you have specific questions on that, he's your guy. I think, thank you, Alexander, for being here, and we'll thank Kees when he arrives. But first, so what I want to do with this session, I have prepared some questions, and I'm already, of course, but the floor is mostly open to you guys. So have your notebooks ready. Maybe you already have some questions from the last week. Think about that. Think about what it means to be a public policy maker, especially here in the Netherlands when it comes to green policy. Maybe some of the barriers you think you'll face as policy maker. And I think Alexander will definitely give his experience and his expertise in this. So let's get started. Now, green policy. We're all aware of the environmental issues we currently face. We have climate change, we have pollutions of our seas, skies, lands, and we see the collapse of the biodiversity around the world. Now, for economists as us, and policymakers, the main question is then, how can we organize our economy to prevent more damage, I would say, but also, and reduce the damage that we've done, but also at the same time try to find a way to sustain the 10 billion people that will be living here in 2050 estimated. So that's quite a big challenge, I would say. I want to first start with the positive. And in your experience, what do you think are success stories when it comes to implementing green policy? What are the factors that bring successful green policy?
Okay, well, maybe I should begin by thanking you for the invitation and by acknowledging that it's a very a happy experience for me to be here, for everything that has remained the same and for everything that has changed. This entire building, of course, wasn't here when I taught here and when I was the rector of this university, so there is a lot of positive change. There's also a continuity, which I appreciate more or less just as much, which is basically the tradition of this university, the tradition of the faculty, the tradition of the RSM. And that tradition, I think, refers in a very strong sense to the name giver of our university, and who I think is certainly one of the finest philosophers Rotterdam has ever produced. There's not a lot of competition there, but also in a very real sense, I think the first great European, and certainly I think somebody whose name should inspire many of you, if not all of you. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm also very happy to be here and discuss with you the topic for today, green policy. I think in that whole range of issues, climate change stands out because it's so big. It's so all-encompassing. It is, to some extent, perhaps to you a bit apocalyptic. Certainly a lot of people have that sentiment, and I would very much like to address it and hopefully come up with some counter-arguments, because apocalypse sentiments are not going to help us at all, and there are many, many good reasons to be more positively inclined. But it is certainly a very, very big topic. And some of you already briefly said, I think you did, that this is also a topic that we cannot afford to ignore. And we cannot afford to ignore in whatever capacity we find ourselves. We cannot ignore it as citizens, as voters. And I hope, by the way, that all of you who could vote recently have voted. And if not, I strongly encourage you to do it next time in this country, if you can, in your own country, if you can, because it is a small but significant contribution that everybody can make. But there are other dimensions to what we are and how we live that are relevant to this discussion. We are, I think, involved, whether we like it or not, as just as citizens, but also as consumers, as people who eat and drink and travel. We are involved as people who work in many, many ways. Some of you intend to go into public service. Some of you, I'm sure, will stay in the private sector. Some of you, like I did, will go in between and maybe change perspective. But in whatever role we find ourselves, these green issues will be part of our daily lives and will be part of our priorities. And for me, having been involved both in the public sector and the private sector, I was on the board of ING Group, yes, financial group, for 10 years, more or less the dominant private part. I think what stands out is also a sense of responsibility and perhaps to some extent a sense of guilt. Because I do feel quite strongly that my generation, if I can call it that, has not delivered the planet to you, the next generation, in the best possible state. On the contrary, I think we have failed quite dramatically to recognize the importance of some of these green issues in time. We have also not done a terribly good job in delivering Europe to you as a continent that is a reliable part of your daily lives. And between the two of them, I think we have a lot to blame ourselves for. So be it. The least we can do, at least, is to give you some suggestions and, who knows, some advice, and to share some experiences with you that may be helpful. Of course, I hope and trust, by the way, that you will do a much better job than we did. And when it comes to green policy, there is some encouraging news, which I would like to begin with, and that is the great success story in the early 80s of the successfully fighting, actually removing a very nasty chemical from the atmosphere, and I hope I get the term right, hexafluorocarbonate. But this was a core ingredient that was hidden inside everything that you buy in a store, and that goes. And so in those years, this particular little ingredient did an enormous amount of damage to the atmosphere. And there was a serious concern, for very good reasons, that the ozone layer was slowly and certainly disappearing. There was a very big hole in the ozone layer that opened up over the North Pole and that grew and grew and grew in size over time. And that was extremely bad news because the ozone layer has a very important role to play in protecting us against the nasty side effects of the sun. And so if that layer would disappear, become thinner and thinner over time, there were enormously negative health implications and many others. And so when this became known and recognized, first, of course, as always is the case, by academics, by researchers, and then increasingly by people in, let's say, who were part of the public debate, there was a huge worry and a huge concern about how to address this particular challenge. But lo and behold, in about 2 years, a great international effort put together a huge conference, and a treaty was signed in Montreal in, I think, 1981 or 1982. And basically every country represented there, and those were more or less all the important countries in the world, I think about 150 or so, agreed to ban this particular chemical from all these sprays within a year. And they delivered. They delivered. Pretty amazing if you think about it, but they did. And so that basically took care of the issue. And the fact that I guess no one here has ever heard of the hole in the ozone layer, it's a very good reason, because the hole is shrinking. And so about 20 years later or so, it became very clear that the analysis was right and the diagnosis was correct. And the hole is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and over time it will just go away. So the moral of that story is we can do it. We can do it. We, in this particular case, being nations of the world, we can get together, we can basically make a common analysis, we can share our perception of the danger, and we can think of the right measures to take. In this particular case, the measure was particularly simple. And so there is something here that we should, to some extent, celebrate and derive confidence from. And if you take a big jump ahead, look at the great conference of Paris, I think there is also a lot of reason to worry, but there is a lot of reason to be extremely proud. Anybody French here, by any chance? You can be proud of the role that your country played in getting the Paris Agreement in place, because it was an incredible effort by French diplomats just to bring together 150 or so nations, essentially every one of which has a veto right. Just think of that, a negotiation, I teach classes on negotiation, a negotiation where you meet 150 people to persuade them to sign that agreement within a few, let's say, weeks. And the French did it. It was just an incredible job. And so you can criticize that treaty for many good reasons, you can argue for many good reasons it should have contained much more than it did, but at the end of the day, the good news is that it's there, and that there has been a follow-up conference in Glasgow, which again you can criticize for many reasons, but I would want to encourage you to be critical, but also to derive some optimism from these accomplishments, because they are non-negligible ones, and in a sense they are rare. So we need to treasure them, we need to, of course, contribute to the follow-up. Many of you will be able to play a positive role there in whatever capacity you find yourselves in. But the thing to celebrate is that there is a starting point that is non-negligible. There is progress here for everybody who subscribes to the importance of green policies. There's also a lot of progress at the level of these huge agreements, these big treaties, and at the level of the continent that I already referred to once, where Europe, of course, is part of our daily lives, not in as flourishing a state as I would have hoped, but it's there. It is proving its worth, and the green policy, the green document that is in place as a European commitment is an enormous step forward compared to what we had previously. So there are lots of things to worry about. Anybody who likes apocalyptic perspectives can find them here, but anybody who likes to be positive and constructive can also derive a lot of confidence from what has happened over the past 15 years or so.
That's a great success story. I was aware of that. I remember from my youth that this whole ozone layer, especially also It was also around Australia. I think there was the whole thing about the rise in skin cancer in those areas.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of worry about it, but yeah, the news that it was shrinking definitely was a good news show. I think when we look at, it's good to look at the positives. It's good to look at how we have already moved. Some of the activists and critical thinkers think we're currently moving too slow, especially, well, we all know the speeches from Greta Thunberg, but more action needs to happen and faster. Do you agree with this statement?
Of course.
Yes.
But of course, and so again, you can be apocalyptic here, but you can also try to be get the right mixture of realism and optimism. And the analysis, this is a complex issue, but in a sense it's also quite simple. Because if you look at what needs to be done to cope with climate change, let's focus on that for a second. There are all sorts of other issues, but I think this is, in a sense, by far the biggest one, and the most apocalyptic one, if you will. And if you look at what we need to do in terms of climate change, fighting climate change, we just need to get rid of carbon dioxide emissions. And we need to do it between now and 2050, period. That's it. And but there are two sides to this. First of all, this is a big challenge, but not an unmanageable one. So we can talk about the details of how that could be done. But there's another side to this, because people, of course, and I'm sure all of you knew already what I just said, so this is not a surprise. But there's also a sense in the public debate, and I think for good reasons, and maybe for very positive reasons initially, that this is an all or nothing thing. If we cannot do it, the world is lost. And that is simply not true either. If we, for whatever reason, as much as I and Garst you would regret it, we do not manage to stop these to become essentially emission CO2, carbon dioxide neutral by 2050, if we cannot manage to do it, the world is not going to disappear overnight. It's just going to be a much more unpleasant place to be. And the worse we do, the more unpleasant it will be. So in that sense, you can be nervous, but you can also realize that every little bit helps. And certainly if we cannot manage to stay the magic barrier between below 1.5 degree increase in global temperature, we cannot manage to do that, then 1.6 is better than 1.7, and 1.7 is better than 1.8, and 1.8 is a lot better than 1.9. So every little bit helps. So even if you are worried, perhaps for good reasons, that we will not manage to get to 1.5, which will be very, very hard, that doesn't mean we give up. It means we just fight as hard as we can and maybe get to 1.6 and 1.7. And again, that is infinitely better than 2.3 and much, much, much better than 2.9, which by current standards, I think is the very, very, very worst that can happen if we don't do anything at all, as far as we know now.
Let's note, I want to also talk to you about, because we know in the Netherlands, Joe, please join us. We just get started, so.
I'm terribly sorry. Excuse me.
That's okay.
Wrong transport, wrong station, wrong bus, telephone bed, all plagues of Egypt. Good morning, everybody. Sorry, Alexander, sorry.
It's, I guess it's Murphy's Law, isn't it? When one thing goes bad, everything goes bad.
A beautiful sunshiny day, but still Murphy's Law.
Okay, I already introduced you, so that you know. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Yes. We were just talking about, well, Alexander already told about the success story of getting the hole in the ozone layer smaller. I'm not going to name the chemical because I can't pronounce that either.
You know, hexafluor.
CFKs.
CFK. Oh, that's easier, yeah.
1986, the Montreal Protocol.
Yes.
What does it mean?
Chloorkool, waterstoffluoride.
Lovely. Well, we have clearly an expert in the house, thank you.
On refrigerators, yes,
yeah,
I'm an expert.
Yeah, on refrigerators and spray cans, I assume. I was just talking about whether the current policy changes are happening fast enough, and I also want to talk with you guys about the ways to are there certain barriers that make the policy not go fast enough, or that slow down the policy, and how do we overcome such barriers?
I don't, you have 1.5 hours to recover from your absence, so I don't kick off.
Okay, I would say the sustainable and inclusive transition by far is not on the right track. Mm-hmm. So in the political arena, majorities are not acting in time. That was also visible, for instance, in the last COP in Glasgow. Yes, we decided, and that's a good decision globally, that 1.5 degrees Celsius maximum temperature rise is the absolute maximum, and that's a strengthening in comparison to the Paris Agreement. Yes. But if you look further into the Treaty of Glasgow, where are the actions? Where is the policy agenda? So obviously, in the political arena, there is a lot of resistance to really adopt strong policies on making this transition work. I have been in politics for many years, in the House of Commons in the Netherlands for 12 years. I've been fiscal and financial spokesman, and my basic experience annually was, year after year, that strong resistance coming from old mainstream industry, especially the fossil industry, was rejecting strong policies, referring to international competition, level playing field, not good enough, we are not ready, don't do that, without, and that was the old paradigm of the last 3 decades, adopting a new role of business. I think if you want to transition to make work, we need business to step in, all sectors, no exception, including finance. I'm working for Triodos today, apart from being a member of the Dutch Senate. I strongly believe that the sustainable inclusive transition, we are living now in the decisive decades, 8 years to go, to really make the change and turn our economy quite radically. We need a deep transition, and it should be a shared responsibility. And if business will do so and adopt this shared responsibility, and that's also the inspiration of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 17, partnerships for the transition, if they do so, and the sustainable economy is coming alive, and there are tangible examples of how a sustainable economy might look like, including all people, it should be an inclusive transition, then there will be more space for the politicians in the mainstream to act in time and to come by, so to say, with strong policies that steer markets in the right direction, repricing, regulation, supervision, what have you. But now I see a kind of stalemate. Yeah. So everybody's waiting for everybody. And to be honest, in terms of power, in terms of vested interests, that's good news for the oil industry. Mm. And we should try to figure a way around vested interests. And I think there is a very important role for business to play here, including finance. And I see some encouraging examples here. CEOs stepping up, big companies like Paul Polman try to do so at Unilever. I see a lot of things happening in the financial sector, including big mainstream financial institutions. Last week, ING, you know ING, announced to stop new fossil investment. And you can say a lot about the small print on the second page of the press release, and that's all true. Still, major shift. That's the kind of leadership we need. And then hopefully politics will feel more free, the political arena, to adopt the proper policies, because steering from governments is quite essential, obviously.
Can I just respond, because I'm intrigued by one term that you used just now, politics can feel more free. What is the restraining politicians? Sure, I recognize, I'm sure all of you will recognize the ingredients of what Kees just said, and I'm very happy that you're here and that we can do this jointly. Yes, there is a need to collaborate. I think there's no dispute there at all. I think, by the way, there is a lot more awareness at the level of business than there used to be. And for instance, I'm very, very happy about the stand in the Netherlands that the Confederation of Netherlands Industries, VNO, the CW, of which I am former chairman, is now taking. Ingrid Thijs, who is the new chairman, the first woman in that role, I think has said all the right things about what business should do, what its responsibility should be. It's a major step forward. But what I don't really see is why politics and politicians shouldn't wait. And so the terminology should feel more free is puzzling to me. So what do you mean?
Well, to be clear, I used to be on the left and green side of politics, so in terms of power, pretty
Young and foolish.
Yes, and I'm still old and foolish now. Now, my experience in the past 3 decades, talking about climate change, talking about biodiversity, ecosystem, inclusiveness was not an issue. That was left out of the equation. We were just talking about the green transition, not about the green and just transition. And immediately, the focus of business and mainstream politics was on the green corner in the economy. So let me give you an example, and that's still very, that response, that impulse is still very vivid today. 4 years ago, the European Commission launched a quite promiseful action plan on sustainable finance. 10 different trajectories, mostly aimed at creating more transparency in financial markets, trying to lay a barrier to greenwashing, because there is greenwashing over all the place in the financial sector, still is. And the crown project of this European Action Plan was the taxonomy. And the first decision made by the European Commission was, what is the taxonomy? It's a kind of language saying what is sustainable. Okay, if you try to understand what's going on in the financial sector, if you look at all assets, bank lending and investments globally, less than 1%, then, and maybe it's 2 or 3%, deserve the label sustainable. My bank is fully sustainable. We are in the very left corner of the financial sector, so to say.
This is the commercial part.
This is the commercial part. You can open a bank account, by the way. You can
Don't overdo it.
Well, that was one of the 2 sentences I got in my pocket coming from communication, obviously. But anyway, so the focus was on the green corner of finance, ignoring what was the real issue. In terms of climate change, that's the fossil industry. Let's get real. If we want to really fundamentally decarbonize our economy, that's the issue. Now, what did the Commission in the taxonomy project focus on the green market? Setting rules, regulations, etc. What does this imply? That the products we sell at Triodos, but many other sustainable competitors in the market, will become more expensive because you have to live up to the regulation, and that's pretty costly. Okay, but that's weird. So the Commission started to focus in the taxonomy on regulating the solution instead of tackling the problem. Now, this scheme, this way of approaching sustainability is all over the place. We don't tackle the issue, we try to regulate the solution. And I think, just to finish, and then I respond, if you try to tackle the issue, it will hurt. I mean, what transition is basically Schumpeter. It's creative destruction. And we like to focus on the creative part, new business, green business, and that's all great. And it's happening, and it should happen, etc. But we forget, we ignore, we step away from the destruction part. We have to phase out a large part of our economy. And for most business in the fossil industry, I think they should really adopt a very deep and profound transition. Otherwise, we don't need them. We should actively put them out of our economy. And that's really hurtful. In agriculture, the same is happening. Focusing on the green part, some subsidies, nice regulation, feel good, but the big issue existing in the industrial complex, especially here in the Netherlands, is not tackled. There's a lot of resistance to do so, although there are many signals that we should have acted 30 years ago, really steering our agricultural project in a different direction. We didn't do so because it hurts. And the politics of pain is extremely difficult, especially for mainstream parties. And I, coming from a green left party, I was free, so to say, because my voters had a different opinion. So I am the lucky bastard here, but for the mainstream politicians, it's really difficult to enter this confrontation with vested interest and be clear and honest about the message. It's gonna hurt. Transition is pain, and we try to forget that. And I think that's the basic structure, the basic motivation why mainstream politicians, your question, Alexander, are reluctant to really
No,
be ambitious here.
Here it is.
my question was inspired by the fact that you said that politicians can feel free. My comment would be that they are already free.
Yeah.
They don't have to wait until the business, whatever business is, makes the moves that you recommend, and that of course I agree with. But the interesting question here is what kind of measures would we like these mainstream politicians to take? And of course, you were talking about making it too easy for business, perhaps not being sufficiently stern and firm. But my comment would be that if any of you want to join public service and contribute to the great cause of sustainability, what you need to think about is not transforming our economy to a North Korean economy where you basically can tell companies what to do, but retain the ingredient that I think we like because it also delivers potential promises, which is that companies can feel free to explore opportunities, but properly constrain them when they do so. And so the question is, what kind of constraints do we need to put in place so that within those constraints, companies can pursue their interests, can apply their creativity, can think of new ideas and interests in new products and services, and yet serve the cause of climate change or sustainability as they go forward. And the one great example here, which I, by the way, think is also a reason for some optimism, is of course the carbon tax. The notion of a carbon tax is the number one example of how this can and should work, because that kind of taxation creates very clear incentive to reduce your contribution as a citizen, as a company, as a producer, to what is the ultimate cause of so many of these issues, the huge emission of carbon dioxide. So we need ideas in the category of carbon taxes. We need ideas that properly constrain businesses so that within these constraints they will do what they need to do, what they can do, and what they can probably do much better than many public servants and politicians. Do we agree?
I fully agree, but I am the desperate optimist here. So let me say,
I'm an optimist.
yes, but
I'm not desperate.
to some extent I'm the desperate one, because I had, as said, I've been in Parliament, I've been fiscal spokesman tax spokesman for 12 years. Bringing taxation, great idea, CO2 taxation, etc. And then especially not burdening citizens because they already pay enough. And the CO2 impact of private consumption is already taken into account in the existing tax schemes in the Netherlands. Now it should be about the big polluters. Aha, now we are there. So for 12 years, annually, I saw a tax plan coming for the government. That's the regular process. 12 years, there was 1 year that the government decided to slightly green the tax mix. Slightly. The other years, there was no offer coming from the government. So in Parliament, we tabled many ideas for strong CO2 taxations, and it was all rejected by the majority. So you might say I have been hopelessly ineffective, and I was, but the fundamental reason is that big business opposed this idea. No, we have to do it in Europe. Okay, then we came up with the ETS. And indeed, from a policy perspective, European taxation is outperforming national taxation. Obviously, that should be the main course, steering the economy by effective CO2 pricing. Totally agree. What happened in Brussels in the beginning of this millennium, 2002, 2003, and so on? Big business stepped in, tried to downplay an effective system there, and pushing for a lot of free emission rights. So there was no taxation, it was a subsidy. So that is what's happening constantly in the transformation. And I would say that we need many things to break the deadlock here. So we need business to step in, CEOs to be vocal, branch organizations like VNO, NCW playing a different kind of music. And hopefully Ingrid Thijssen, the current chair of VNO, NCW, is really moving this big ship of vested interest in the good direction. That will be a tough job for her. But big business should stop lobbying against effective CO2 pricing. Take, for instance, the airline industry. The same is true. That's a fiscal paradise in terms of subsidies, because kerosene is not taxated because of the Treaty of Chicago of 1944. And there are many implicit subsidies coming from the government going to the airline industry. So it's a business-wise and sustainability-wise a very unhealthy sector. As we speak, our national champion KLM is lobbying in Brussels against stronger regulations, against phasing out these kind of subsidies. That's what's happening. So that's why I emphasize the very important role big business leaders should play here, changing the conversation within the market, within their own domain, and then enable and free the branch organizations to deliver different measures.
Yes, if I can interrupt, because I think both of you, I see some tension here as well in approaches, but both of you seem to agree in a direction we're going. I was wondering, if you're looking at the current measures and the measures that we have taken so far, there's some criticism that we focus too much on the role of the individual consumer and the role of the consumer in the market. What do you think is the proper balance between having a good focus on the consumer and the role of the consumer and the role of the producer or the market players here when it comes to policy?
Well, that's a big question, and I'm not sure there even is a single answer here that works. But for my money, I would say let's do both, and let's continue to do both, because at the end of the day, that's where the difference will be. And I think there are plenty of opportunities left on both sides of this particular equation. So when it comes to properly incentivizing consumers, surely there are ways in which we can make it more attractive than it currently is for all of us to focus on products that are to some extent sustainability supporting and not destructive of the environment. And that can be an issue of incentives that are monetary, but they can also be an issue of incentives that are simply in terms of communicating properly what the product stands for that you're about to purchase. One issue that is not so much fiscal, but very much a government policy is to properly inform the public about the products they're about to buy. And this has been an issue that has irritated me for a long time, because it is so hard to organize that properly and to allow all of us to pick and choose properly among the variety of labels and certificates that are now part of consumption products, some of which are completely genuine and honest, some of which seem to be distorting the truth of anything else. And the challenge is clear, and at the same time, the response to the challenge is very difficult. Let me give you one small example. I was on the board for a while, Sara Lee, and Sara Lee is a coffee producer. And in coffee production, there were two competing certificates, Max Havelaar and UTZ. And interestingly enough, my natural inclination, Kees will be happy to hear this, was to go for Max Havelaar, only for the reason that he is a famous Dutch author. And how many of you know who Max Havelaar, what Max Havelaar stands for? Any of you read the book? Read the book. It's probably the best Dutch novel ever written, already about 100 years ago. So Max Havelaar on one side of the coin, the other side of the coin was UTZ, which seemed to be the bad guy in the discussion. But if you look into the details, it's not so simple. It's not so simple. I'm sure Kees will have an opinion here, not necessarily mine. This is probably not the right location to have a deep discussion on coffee branding, but I remember realizing these issues are complex. And sometimes the sustainability can be a multi-dimensional thing. In fact, it is a multi-dimensional thing. Not all of these dimensions necessarily support each other. Can be a tension between which makes it hard. So on the consumer side, yes, let's make fiscal incentives part of the story, but not the full story.
Yes.
And similarly, on the company side, let's make fiscal incentives part of the story, especially anything that reduces, say, carbon dioxide emissions is a good thing, but there is much more to it than that. And we would like, I think, companies to be also positively motivated to transform their production process and their production output in a sustainable direction.
Just on more critical note on the fact of labeling in general, do you think that so when you put a label on a product, it's the role of the consumer to make the trade-off. It's the role of the consumer to make the trade-off between whether I go for fair trade, do I go for organic, do I go for a fair price or a price that I can pay, or do I go for in food good taste, for example? Do you think?
Or perhaps both.
Do you think it's the responsibility of the consumer to make that trade-off, or is it the responsibility of the industry to make those trade-offs for the consumer?
Well, I think it's in the responsibility of the industry to properly inform the consumer what the consequences of his choice are. And again, this is a multi-dimensional thing. For instance, we can, I think, for very solid and good reasons, have a strong preference for what is, I think, often called biological, dynamical food, biologisch, dynamisch eten, to the Dutch, sustainable food. But we should realize that to produce that food is a complex challenge and that it is simply undoable to ensure that the entire population of this globe will be fed within the constraints that this particular subset of producers set themselves. So you can set as good reasons to do so, but at the same time you should realize there's a bigger challenge to just cater to your private, expensive, but for us, affordable preferences.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any notes on that?
Yes.
Where is your role as a consumer in that? Yeah.
No, I would say yes. Consumer behavior does matter, but let me be very clear. In the 1990s, I remember our government launched a campaign. Een beter milieu begint bij jezelf. A better environment starts with yourself, I guess is the proper translation. Profoundly wrong. It's not true. A better environment starts with strong policy and sustainable business. And yeah, consumer behavior does matter. In order to create enough traction in consumer markets, rewarding sustainable companies, obviously. But the sequence the government expressed by using this phrase was profoundly mistaken in my view. So all our attention was focused, what should I do? It's apparently my responsibility. And where is the rest of the world? I mean, we are talking about sustainabilized capitalism. So we should talk about big business and talk about capital. That's the proper sequence, and we didn't do so. And we are still trying to figure a way out to increase the shared responsibility here instead of focusing on humans. Next, the other remark I would like to make is, yeah, consumers, we are talking about citizens. If you are taking seriously that the transition should be an inclusive one, we should not only look at people as being a consumer on the market. No, we are citizens. First and foremost, we are citizens of a country. So I think a proper transition policy, and that's already happening in the energy domain, that we should get rid of the old industrial system, which is exclusively based on big power plants, using coal, gas, or whatever, and move to a completely different market scheme with sometimes big productions, say offshore wind, that are big companies, a lot of money, great investment, big risk, a lot of technology involved. That's big business on sea. Combine it with a decentralized system, if it's possible, owned by citizens themselves. So I would like to talk not only about the role of consumers, but of the role of citizens. I think that's really powerful, because citizens bring that message when they enter the market, when they consume, when they start business. when they start joining a company and start another conversation at a coffee machine.
Or when they are shareholders.
I'm gonna stop you there because I'm looking at time as well. Is it okay if we run out over time? Yeah, because I really want to give you guys chances also. And I know the gentleman can keep talking. I can't really interrupt here, but that's fine.
I already missed my bus today.
Yeah,
so
that's okay.
Now I need to catch mine.
Yeah. In that sense, also we know that today the new report for the Central Bureau of Statistics show that taxation is not right at the moment, not promoting equality, economic equality, but that also in mind of being a citizen, being a person paying taxes in that sense. But up to you guys. Are there any questions on this very nice story? You see that there are similar visions, but there are some dimensions and difference. Yes, go ahead.
So I have 2 questions, so feel free to pick whichever you want to answer, but I want to come back to what you started with at the beginning with the success of reducing the hole in the ozone layer, thanks to the Montreal Protocol, if I understood correctly. So why was that protocol comparatively more successful than recent climate agreements, namely Paris and Glasgow, practically at least? And then the second question is, you mentioned that either big businesses like in fossil fuel and the agribusiness sector, either they properly transition or we phase them out of the economy. And my question is, how do we phase them out, and when do we decide whether we should do so? To the extent of like, how do we assess that they have or have not done enough in terms of transitioning, so that we justify phasing them out?
Okay. Well,
So on the first question, the comparison between the Montreal Agreement and the climate agreement here in Paris and Glasgow recently. So what are the factors that make that Montreal successful?
That's very simple. It was much simpler.
Mm-hmm.
There was just one ingredient that we had to worry about, and it was also pretty clear where that ingredient was located. So if we could just transform that technology, which also turned to be chemically feasible, there was an alternative that would work just as well, but did not damage the ozone layer. So it was a very, in that sense, simple transition, and the trick was to get all these countries to do it. And that was done successfully. It is by no means as complicated as Paris, for which I already gave your country some credit, and Glasgow and all the other big international agreements. So, okay, now you can explain how you want to get rid of
I will, maybe a nice recommendation on your first question. Check YouTube. Noordwijk. That's a small city and close to the beach in the Netherlands. And Ed Nijpels, the then Minister of Environment. The first conference on the part of the parties, we're heading Glasgow the 26th, and we are heading for the 27th in Egypt later this year. The first conference of the party took place in Noordwijk, 3 years after the Montreal Protocol. And the idea of Ed Nijpels was, he was a great minister, leadership, thankfully. Okay, let's bring together the main polluters globally, so roughly the OECD countries. And he invited them to Noordwijk. And if you look at this short documentary, it's really funny to see what happened there. It was pretty amateuristic in terms, if you look at the current image of the COPs, big halls and thousands of people. I think there were about 150 people present in Noordwijk, OECD countries. And indeed, there was a mandatory agreement on the table based on the same logic as the Montreal Protocol, limiting global climate change to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Hey, that's was already at the table then, with mandatory reduction obligations for all OECD countries and some others to adopt. And he was almost there the last day to reach an agreement. And then there was an intervention coming from the United States. John Sununu, then Chief of Staff of President Bush, made a phone call to the American Minister of the Environment. I forget his name. No, we can't do it. Stop. So, yeah, Montreal was really an inspirational, creating an inspirational wave, creating a kind of similar agreement on climate change and CO2 emissions. And at Naples was quite close to the exit, but yeah, then it was swept away off the table.
And it happened again. Huh? I mean, it was not the first,
Yeah.
maybe the first time and not the last time. So
Yeah.
we have to take some responsibility here. Our generation of politicians just was unable to deliver this on time.
Yeah. So nice story to if you want to go back in history, like YouTube at Naples. Now on the fossil industry, I think there is much more needed than I can think of, but I think finance will play a major role. That's why I mentioned yesterday's example of ING making and taking into account the history of ING. Okay, that's not bad. That a major bank with much international exposure follows the European Investment Bank, just saying we don't do new fossil investment. Okay, that's a strong message to the fossil companies, and sending a strong message to asset management industry, to Larry Fink of BlackRock, who's talking a lot but doing differently in boardrooms and consultations if he manages assets that are relevant for companies. I think that's the kind of change we need. It starts with the financial sector. No, not only starts, but that's pretty important. And then governments will come by and say, we're going to ban new fossil investments, we're going to stop. And we transform the movement in the market into legislation and try to build a coalition of the willing. So ministries of finance will be quite important. There is a kind of coalition of ministries of finance. That was an initiative a few years taken by the Finnish government. And I think that kind of coalitions might be important to see what's going on in the market and strike in the right time and try to create support for an international ban on fossil investment for phasing out, because you should do it in time. You cannot say tomorrow stop. No, you have to say now we're going to stop in 2030, 2035 or whatever. And I think that's the kind of dance we need. Finance, big business and politics. That might help. And don't forget the supervisory authorities. ECB, DNB, very important in this respect, because they are in the game for financial stability and they increasingly understand that the supervisory framework that banks have to comply with, climate change should be at the heart of this supervisory framework. And that's now happening. So people like Frank Elderson, I'm a great fan of Frank Elderson. He moved from the Dutch Central Bank to the ECB. He's quite vocal there. He has significant impact. See the recent speeches of Christine Lagarde about greening monetary policy, same cup of tea. So supervision and what's going on in that world is also quite relevant, changing the conversation and really pushing forward and helping politicians in national and international domains to be really courageous.
Yeah, I wanted to ask your opinion about the issue of inequalities in this topic. So it's a question I asked panelists from the green finance discussion earlier this week. So a paper was recently published trying to show correlations between income and wealth inequalities and greenhouse gas emissions inequalities. And basically showing that the bottom 50% of the world is only emitting 12%, and the richer you are, the more you emit. And they also highlight that most of these inequalities are within countries. So it's the richer within Western countries, basically, that are emitting the most.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask whether addressing inequality is part of the solution, and especially within country inequality.
Well, I'll give you the verb. I mean, this is you know, the same Dutch. Een voorzet voor open doel.
Yes. Well, let me try to score. Now, obviously, I don't think it's just relevant. It's the most fundamental condition. We won't tackle climate change globally unless there is climate justice. And basically that means that the countries that are responsible historically for the largest part of global emissions should act first. And that's a difficult conversation because we all know who that is, the United States, and then Europe, And then there is an empty space, and then we are going to talk about China, India, and some others. And that's not really acknowledged, or at least that's not a common base. If you look at Glasgow, that's still a fight. So I was in the COP in Copenhagen 14 years ago. Already then, this was at the heart of the discussion, climate justice, meaning that poor countries should have support to adapt to inevitable climate change. A $100 billion fund already promised by the northern countries and never delivered until this very day. So that's pretty shameful. And what is relevant between nations is also relevant within nations.
But it's a different story. And so as much as I agree with what you just said, I think your question also was about inequality within countries. And that is a relevant issue, but let's acknowledge also a complex issue. Very interestingly illustrated and rather embarrassingly by what the Dutch government did recently when fuel prices shot through the roof. And the only measure they could come up with is lower them across the board by the same amount. And of course, it doesn't take rocket science economics to figure out that that is not going to aid and support equality, it's going to increase inequality. So even at this very basic level, governments find it hard to address these needs simultaneously. And of course, in a sense, the search for and the quest for equality is much older than the climate problem. It's one of the basic ingredients for political debate since the last 300 years. But it takes on a specific significance when climate change forces us to reform economies and countries politically, and at the same time serve this particular need. Because it is all too easy for many of us, when we are sufficiently wealthy and affluent, to adapt and secure a more sustainable consumption pattern without realizing that to do that for people at a different degree of income and wealth is much, much harder. So the additional constraint that many of these measures that are necessary and important need to satisfy is that they also do not further increase the already prevailing inequality that exists between the rich and the poor within every nation.
Isn't that also a story of power? So, the story of the ones having currently the welfare. We know about the US just stopping or even signing off or withdrawing from the climate agreement. The ones that need to change the most have the most political power, even within the country. Do you, as policymakers, have you experienced that, and how do you, in your daily working as policymakers, try to manage that, try to balance that, the political power of these wealthy parties?
I don't have the answer to that. I mean, that's really relevant. The relationship between the strength of political parties and the development and the distribution of wealth. And obviously, also in the Dutch parliament are parties that are quite successful in protecting these interests.
Yeah.
I mean,
we have to acknowledge it for what it is. It's one of the great political struggles of all times.
Yes.
And it will never be completely resolved, but it requires a particular urgency when the need to transform our economies into a sustainable direction is so strongly upon us as it is today. So it's not a new issue, it is a fundamental issue, a philosophical issue, but at the same time also a very urgent practical challenge.
Yes.
My time is now running out.
Yes, time is definitely running out.
Can I just add one
small thing? Yes.
I think. A few years ago, you might now remember the Dutch government launched the process of the Dutch climate agreement. So government, NGOs, stakeholders, business, energy, housing, agriculture, everybody came together, develop a transition plan for the Netherlands. Now on built environment, and I think that's a beautiful example, stressing the importance of a clever policy design for the built environment, there were many options on the table. One was and there was a lot of push for that solution, give grants to private home owners. That help them to sustainabilize their own houses. If you do so, you ignore all the tenants. I mean, then the money flows to the higher incomes, obviously. So, luckily enough, there were others that pushed for other directions. And just one example of the current state of affairs in the housing market in the Netherlands, starting in 2012, 2013, you know, housing corporations, social housing corporations play a major role in the housing market. And they were pushed by the government to increase the energy performance of their portfolio. Now, there are two ways to do that. The good way is really look into your portfolio and identify the parts of your portfolio with the baddest energy performance and do some renovation and da-da-da-da. No, many corporations did otherwise. They started selling the worst parts of their portfolio. Who did buy these houses? Low-income countries, minimum wage plus, so to say. Just able to get a very small mortgage to buy this apartment with a G
People, not countries.
Sorry, people, yeah. Just able to do so. Now, about 50,000 of these apartments with a very bad energy performance are now in possession of low-income people. That's bad. I think we should be ashamed for the fact that we sold these houses. It has been public property turned into private property, and with rising energy prices, with a transition, they are standing with their hands back to the wall. No money to make the transition, paying a very high energy bill.
So
it should be a policy decision, in my view, that we should repair this and start funding, public funding, to help these people to make the transition. Because these people are now really mad. And if somebody rings at the door and say, hey, there is climate change, go away. That's the response. So inequality is also really hurtful for support, general support for the transition. And this is a very tangible, example, and there are many more. And if you want to lose people, that's the best way to do it.
Okay, so I think there's a lot of good lessons learned here. I'm sorry that we're over time. I think we have a lot more questions coming. And I'm not sure if the gentleman, I think Alexander, you have other appointments. Busy man as always. Kees, you have still some time for students, or?
Sure, I have the whole afternoon if you want me to stay here.
Well,
as long as you
okay,
open
give
it
him a
up.
I hope you were inspired also by these gentlemen. Alexander, of course, you have to go. If you want to have some private conversation with Kees, please do so. I know he's really keen to sharing his knowledge and experience. I want to thank everybody for joining. I also want to thank the organizers for organizing this panel. I think it's very good to have direct contact with the policymakers and with experience. And thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Kees.
Thank you.
Thank you.